Across myths and legends from around the world, one theme keeps coming back. Humans breaking taboos. People crossing lines they were never supposed to cross. But why? Why would a perfectly rational person suddenly lose themselves in a crowd, screaming, dancing, doing things they would never dream of doing on an ordinary day? People have been trying to answer that question for a very long time. And the answer that emerged wasn't a theory or a philosophy textbook. It was a myth, a festival, a lived experience that pushed human emotion to an intense limit. At the center of it all stood one of the most fascinating and most deeply human figures in Greek mythology, Dionysus. This isn't just a story about an ancient god. What we're really exploring today is something hidden inside the feast of Dionysus, the most complicated layers of human nature itself: pleasure and disorder, freedom and fear, reason, and everything that lies beyond it. And at the end of this journey, we might come face to face with the most uncomfortable and most honest question the ancient Greeks ever left us. Do we have that same impulse inside us? Let's start at the beginning. Who exactly was Dionysus? The gods of Olympus usually have a clear, clean image. Apollo is the god of the sun, reason, and the arts. Athena is wisdom and strategy. Ares is war. Each of them has a defined domain, a clear identity. Dionysus is different. From the very beginning, he was born out of contradiction, literally. The way he came into the world was unlike anything else in Greek mythology. The story starts with Semele, a princess of Thebes. Zeus, king of the Olympian gods, falls in love with her, and she becomes pregnant with his child. But Hera finds out. Consumed by jealousy, she disguises herself as an old woman and whispers in Semele's ear, "If he's really Zeus, ask him to show you his true form." Semele, not knowing any better, falls for it. She begs Zeus to grant her one wish. He's already made a promise, so he has no choice. He reveals himself in an overwhelming divine form, and Semele cannot survive that encounter. But the child inside her was still alive. Zeus rescued the unborn baby and kept him safe within his own body until he was ready to be born. And so Dionysus came into the world, having lost his mother, born a second time from the body of a god. That's why he's been called, since ancient times, the twice-born god. Once from a mortal woman, once from a god. This isn't just a strange birth story. It's the whole point. Dionysus exists somewhere between human and divine, between life and death, between instinct and reason, between civilization and raw nature. He is the god of the boundary, the one who doesn't belong cleanly on either side. His childhood wasn't easy either. Hidden away to escape Hera's anger, he was raised by nymphs and the satyr Silenus on a mystical mountain called Nyssa. During those wandering years, he discovered the grapevine and learned to make wine. Then he set out to share it with the world. His journey took him from Thrace to Egypt, across Asia, all the way to India. Wherever he was welcomed, joy and abundance followed. Wherever he was rejected, disorder and turmoil followed instead. That duality is what sets Dionysus apart from every other god on Olympus. He brings celebration, but he also unsettles ordinary structures of reason and order. So who followed him the most? Vivid of his followers in Greek mythology were the Maenads, whose name is often understood as referring to women in ecstatic ritual states. These were women who left their cities behind and moved into remote spaces outside ordinary civic life. They wore fawn skins, carried a staff, called the Catharsis, and sang and danced through the night in sacred rituals. The details of what happened in those rituals vary from story to story, but the core is always the same. They stepped outside their everyday roles and social identities and entered a state the ancient Greeks called enthusiasmos, which roughly translates as having a god enter you. That's actually the root of the English word enthusiasm. Think about that for a second. The word we use for passion and excitement originally meant being filled with divine presence. That alone says a lot about how the Greeks understood intense human experience. Now let's look at what the myths tell us about the festivals of Dionysus and what they represented. The festivals held in his honor were collectively known as the Dionysia, and it wasn't just one event. There were several forms, each carrying its own meaning within the mythology. The oldest and most mysterious was the rural Dionysia. The grandest celebration was the city Dionysia, also called the Great Dionysia. And in late winter, there was the Anthesteria, a festival for opening the new wine, which also served as a time to honor the dead. According to the myths and traditions surrounding Dionysus, the Great Dionysia unfolded over 5 to 6 days every spring. It began with a procession carrying the statue of Dionysus from a small temple outside the city walls, all the way to the theater. This procession was said to recreate the mythological moment when Dionysus first arrived in Greece. People joined the march, singing together, filling the streets with music. Not so different from a modern parade or carnival, but that was just the opening act. The heart of the festival was theater. Competitions in tragedy and comedy ran for days. Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, Aeschylus' Oresteia, some of Euripides' greatest works. All of them were born out of this mythological tradition, performed as offerings within the sacred space of the festival. The birthplace of some of the most enduring stories in human culture was a festival stage dedicated to a god. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Actors wore masks. In Greek, those masks were called persona, which is the direct root of our modern words person and personality. Wearing a mask wasn't just about hiding your face. It was an act of transformation. An ordinary person who put on a mask could become a king, a god, an entirely different human being. A single actor might play multiple roles by switching masks, and men regularly played female characters. That transformation behind the mask was the essence of the Dionysian spirit. For a while, you stop being yourself. You become something else entirely. If you want to understand how powerful that experience is, just think about why we're so drawn to actors in films and television. The impulse is the same. The Anthesteria showed a different side of all this. As winter edged towards spring, the new wine jars were opened for the first time. The first evening was called Pythoegia, the day of opening jars. People tasted the fresh wine and gave thanks to the god. But what makes the Anthesteria genuinely fascinating in the mythology is that it wasn't purely celebratory. This was understood as a time when the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. Because of this, the usual social boundaries temporarily softened. The ordinary hierarchy of the world was briefly turned upside down. This is one of the earliest mythological templates for what we now call carnival, the world in temporary reversal. And then there were the more secretive forms of worship described in the myths. Rituals known in Greek as orgia, meaning secret rites, were closed. Ceremonies open only to those who had been initiated. Participants carried torches up into the mountains and spent the night singing, dancing, and moving deeper into a state of sacred intensity. The myths and legends surrounding these rituals were deliberately kept vague, and that vagueness itself tells us something about how profound and personal those experiences were said to be. Those who took part were described as giving themselves over to the ritual, until their usual sense of self began to recede into something larger, a collective energy that felt like more than just human. At this point, I want to pause and ask you something. Was all of this simply an ancient story? Or is there something inside it that speaks to something real in all of us? Greek mythology gives us some of the most rational, architecturally precise thinking ever put into story form. Myths of gods who embody logic, strategy, and order. And yet, the mythology also gave us Dionysus, a god who exists specifically to unsettle all of that. So why did the Greeks need both? That is the deepest question that the Feast of Dionysus asks us. And the ancient Greeks already had an answer. They just expressed it through myth and ritual rather than written argument. The myth that cuts closest to this question is Euripides' Bacchae. The central figure is Pentheus, king of Thebes. He refuses to accept the divinity of Dionysus and tries to ban his worship from the city. He's rational, orderly, and believes in control. On the surface, he sounds like a responsible ruler, but the myth delivers a deeply unsettling message through this character. Whatever you've suppressed may eventually return in more disruptive ways. The ending of the story is genuinely tragic, and I'll leave the specific details aside here. What matters is that Pentheus is ultimately overtaken by the very disorder he tried to keep out. The myth is asking us directly, are you looking away from the impulses inside you? And if you are, where do you think they're going? From here, let's step into the world of ideas. Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, confronted this question head-on in his work, The Birth of Tragedy. He described all human art and culture as shaped by two fundamental drives, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian represents form, order, reason, individual identity, and the clarity of a dream. The Dionysian represents ecstatic immersion, the dissolving of the individual self, and primal energy. According to Nietzsche, the greatest achievements of Greek tragedy came from the collision and harmony of these two forces. When Dionysian energy is held within Apollonian form, the result is the deepest art human beings are capable of experiencing. But what was Nietzsche really trying to say? He argued that the ancient Greeks didn't turn away from the pain and tragedy of existence, and they didn't try to reason their way past it. Instead, through the mythology and festivals of Dionysus, they went directly into that pain, transformed it into art, and channeled extreme emotion into sacred ritual. That, Nietzsche believed, was how they were able to say yes to life, even knowing how painful it could be. He saw this as an expression of genuine strength and vitality, and he warned that when pure reason becomes the only value, something essential and alive gets left behind. Aristotle adds another dimension here. In his Poetics, he explained the function of tragedy through a concept he called catharsis. When an audience watches a tragedy unfold, they experience intense feelings of fear and pity, and through that experience, they undergo an emotional purification catharsis. It's almost a medical metaphor. By safely experiencing extreme emotions within the contained space of the theater, people became better equipped to handle those same emotions in daily life. The entire tradition of Dionysian festivals was built on this principle. Rather than suppressing extreme feeling, give it a defined time, a defined place, and a collective container. Allow those emotions to be experienced in a safe, shared setting. Then return to ordinary life, lighter and clearer than before. That was the wisdom woven into the mythology of Dionysus. Which brings us to the question I find most interesting of all. Is this ancient mythology, or are we still living some version of it today? Think about a massive music festival in the middle of summer. Tens of thousands of people packed into one space, moving to the same music, arms in the air, singing with strangers they've never met and will probably never see again. Someone who struggles to make eye contact in daily life finds themselves completely merged with the crowd. The same thing happens at concerts, at sports arenas, anywhere. A group of people share an overwhelming emotional experience together. The individual edges start to blur. You stop feeling separate. How different is that really from the mythological feast of Dionysus? The shape has changed. The essential human need has not, loosening the boundaries of the individual self and entering a strong sense of collective energy, releasing what's been held back in ordinary life. Modern psychology backs this up. Researchers who study crowd behavior describe a phenomenon called de-individuation, where a person's individual identity becomes absorbed into group identity. Emotional expression intensifies, decision-making shifts. This can sometimes have unintended effects, but it also gives people something deeply valuable, a genuine sense of release, connection, and belonging. The ancient Greeks understood this mechanism, and rather than leaving it unmanaged, they built it into their traditions, not disorder for its own sake, but a structured form of collective release. That was the deeper meaning encoded in the mythology of Dionysus. But here's a question worth sitting with. Has modern life lost that space? We have festivals and concerts, yes, but at the same time, more and more of us are encountering intense emotional stimulation alone, in front of a screen, scrolling through content designed to provoke strong reactions. Maybe those are the fragmented remnants of a Dionysian impulse that no longer has a proper home. There is one critical difference, though. The mythological feast was shared. An entire community gathered in the same place, moved through the same experience together, and then walked back into daily life together. What we do now, we largely do alone. Separate rooms, separate screens, separate experiences. And what we're left with often isn't catharsis. It's a low grade, craving for ever stronger stimulation, with nothing truly resolved. There's one more layer to the myth of Dionysus that deserves attention. In many stories, those who rejected him most forcefully faced the most serious consequences. In legend after legend, those who tried to suppress or deny his power met tragic ends. In the language of myth, Dionysus grows stronger the more you try to contain him. Translated into something we can all recognize, you cannot fully suppress the instinctive, collective, emotionally driven parts of human nature. When you push them down, they don't simply disappear, they tend to reappear in other forms. The mythology understood this, which is why the Dionysian tradition didn't try to stop the release. It gave the release a sacred shape. That's the deeper wisdom encoded in the story. Imagine the morning after the feast. The festival is over. The people who spent days dancing, watching tragedies, singing in the streets, are now filing back into their ordinary lives. The marketplace reopens. The assembly convenes. Reason returns. Order is restored, but it's subtly different from before the festival. Something has been processed. Something has been released. The celebration wasn't a break from civilization. It was preparation for it. Human beings cannot live as purely rational creatures. That's not what we are. But we also cannot live as pure instinct, with no shape or structure to hold us. We live somewhere between those two poles, constantly working to find the balance. The Feast of Dionysus was a mechanism for that balance. In order to sustain a world built on reason, the mythology made sacred space to regularly, collectively, and safely step briefly outside ordinary restraint. It gave that space a god's name, a festival shape, and the language of art.
Do we have a space like that today? How are we making peace with what we push down? Or are we not making peace with it at all? What is that restless longing, the one that keeps seeking ever stronger stimulation, without ever feeling quite full? The questions that the ancient Greeks were trying to face through, the mythology of Dionysus, are still sitting in front of us. Thousands of years later, they don't go away, because they were never really questions about the past. They were always questions about human nature. What is desire? What do we do with extreme emotion? Is suppression the answer? Or is it just the beginning of a larger problem? Is a life of pure reason even possible? Is it even something worth wanting? And most importantly, do we understand that impulse within ourselves? The Feast of Dionysus is long over, but the questions it raised have never ended. And as long as we have the courage to face those questions honestly, the human story continues. Somewhere between reason and impulse, order and release, civilization and wild nature, human beings keep searching for balance. The ancient Greeks put that search into the name of a god, Dionysus, the twice-born god, the god who crosses every boundary, and perhaps the most human god of all.
Next time, we explore another great legacy, born in the shadow of the Dionysian myth. Why did the ancient Greeks put human suffering on a stage? And how did watching that suffering become a source of comfort and wisdom? The birth of tragedy is the story we'll tell in the next episode.